Many thanks for joining us. I'm Felicity Ezewuike. On today's program, two issues are top priority. First is the ongoing 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, which opened yesterday. It is the most representative multilateral forum globally, and it's holding amidst an ongoing war, new political crisis in West Africa and Latin America, economic instability, widening inequality, and fresh natural disasters in the forms of devastating earthquakes, floods, and fires. Lasting until September 26, this year's assembly, compared to previous ones, analysts say, is placing greater emphasis on the Global South countries. The understanding is that several high-level meetings to be held during the session will focus on the priorities of developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. These include, but is not limited to, climate, health, and financing. African countries have a unique opportunity to make their voices loud and clear regarding their role in reimagining solutions to African and global challenges. Less than 2 weeks after being admitted under the African Union into the G20, a group of countries that arguably dominates global economics and politics, Africa will have 40 leaders at UNGA this week. Dozens of them will deliver speeches. They've already started, along with several other leaders. Heads of states and government from at least 145 countries are expected in attendance, a truly global stage. But what are African leaders telling the world? What will they table at the UN? What should be Africa's priorities at this crucial meeting of world leaders? My guest is Professor Mukesh Kapila, Emeritus University of Manchester and former senior UN official. Thank you very much for giving us your time, sir.
I'm glad to join you.
So while the effectiveness of the UN has been questioned for as long as it has existed, it still holds some real value. Please help remind us, what is the point of the UN General Assembly?
Well, the UN General Assembly is the only forum in the world where all member states, big or small, west or east, and north or south, come together as equals to talk about issues and differences and debate and dialogue, as well as challenge each other. And we have many other fora. The G20 was held recently, the BRICS and so on. But this is the only fora, only multilateral fora where everyone can come together. So in that sense, it is the only universal forum in the world. And preserving that is extremely important to take the temperature and pulse of the world. And this is what I think this session is now particularly doing.
Okay, I mentioned in my introduction that several high-level meetings will focus on the priorities of developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Compared to previous assemblies, is there any particular reason why this year's event is placing a greater emphasis on the Global South countries?
Well, developing countries have been complaining that for the last few years, the focus has been on Ukraine and what we would say climate change, which is relevant to the Global South. But fundamentally, the focus has been on the more developed countries, and the developing countries of the Global South have been ignored. And so the UN is trying in this year's General Assembly to bring the focus back on development, particularly on the lesser developed and least developed countries. So in an attempt to correct that. However, you can't ignore the reality that we live in an extremely divided world. So while this is a brave attempt to talk about substantive issues, I'm afraid there's a lot of argument that has already started and will color what happens in coming days.
Okay, I was going to stay on the Global South a bit, but you just mentioned drama is going to be happening, and many analysts have said that. What are the areas that you expect them to be some real drama on issues?
I think the first big drama is going to be on finance. So the global South countries are complaining that they suffered badly under COVID, but they got a bad deal. Now, aid is not getting through to them that they really need. And with climate change coming along and pressure on developing countries to do much more, the finance is not keeping up with the promises that have already been made. So, so there is this feeling amongst developing countries that they're being shortchanged by the West, by the richer countries, and the richer part of the world is not doing its fair share about creating a sustainable world. And the suffering and poverty and the consequences of climate change and disasters are being felt more and more in the developing world, while the developed world insulates itself more and more in an increasingly fractured world. So it's about that geopolitics, but an indicator of geopolitics is really about financing.
Okay, those are actually the key. All I have seen on Conversations to Expect at the UNGA is finance, climate change, SDGs, and basically equality. Let's stay with looking at the Global South. Richard Gowan, that's the UN director of the International Crisis Group think tank, believes that this year, when the countries of the Global South have set their agenda, that means he's saying that they've set the agenda, what are Africa's priorities during the General Assembly? Because if you're setting the agenda, you're supposed to have some key priorities, maybe either aligning with the global desires or peculiar to the African continent. What are these priorities that should be expressed at the General Assembly?
Well, this depends on the perspective of the speaker. So from my perspective, as a non-African, but as a friend of Africa, I would say that Africans need to be honest about their problems and their limitations. In particular, the violence that is going on in the continent, the poor governance that is now infecting all parts of the continent, and to be honest, that unless more political stability and more human rights and greater democracy comes to the continent, I'm afraid the aspiration for development and weathering the climate crisis are going to remain just that, a pipe dream. But I very much doubt whether the African leaders that are present there, including some of the despots and dictators, who would otherwise not be able to travel very much, but they're allowed into New York for the General Assembly, I doubt they're going to say that. And it doesn't help that the African Union itself is very divided by these sorts of issues. So I'm afraid Africans are not being honest amongst themselves, and that, I think, is going to be reflected in a fractured dialogue in New York. And that is a great pity for the peoples of Africa.
No, really, I'm quite curious as to not having. There seems to be a momentum. Some persons have complimented African leaders for how they have handled or taken part in trying to seek for solution to the Ukraine crisis, because it affects everyone, the war in Ukraine. But we'll come back to that a bit. I want you to talk about this concern that's been raised, that the U.S. and other Western countries, when they talk about, giving the Global South more attention, them setting the agenda, maybe like Africa, it's more like their efforts to win over this Global South to their side. Are they really granting developing countries a more equal status and opportunity, or is this sort of global solidarity quest that's being touted another loud, meaningless rhetoric targeted at primarily securing support to further isolate Russia?
Well, let's be realistic about it. The Sustainable Development Goals, which are the centerpiece of for discussions in the first part of this week, they are about global solidarity. But as you know, halfway through the Agenda 2030, we're way behind their achievement. And the failures and the hurts and costs of that failure are being felt in the African continent more than any other region in the world. And solidarity to overcome the divides in terms of human development that are starkly evident and getting worse are definitely should be underpinning the world coming together. But unfortunately, this is where the current geopolitics comes in. We know that the world is divided. We know that major wars are going on around the world, and Ukraine is the front runner in that, but not the only one, but not the only conflict. Africa itself is home to many coups and conflicts, as you know. And what that effectively means is that it's a pipe dream to talk in that fractured world, to talk about shoveling large quantities of funding for African development, when actually there are much more existentialist issues at stake for the world's biggest donors. The conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere are costing trillions. So the $500 million that the UN is requesting every year extra for development, or the $100 million a year requested for climate adaptation, is peanuts in the global order of things. Where is the money going to come from? So I'm afraid Africans have to look more internally for these solutions. They cannot expect the other parts of the world, who some of them are richer, some of them are not so rich, to come to Africa's rescue, because the world has changed. And it's a real politic of the present that African institutions and African leaders must engage with, not wishful thinking, not harking to some kind of utopia out there where everyone is going to treat everyone else with dignity and respect. I'm afraid that world has long since gone.
So when you say Africa should look inward, then what is the place of UNGA, for instance? The continent just became an official member of the G20. Isn't there benefits to being part of these global bodies that could benefit Africa if they come together? While they're looking inward, they still need that solidarity, don't they?
Yes, by looking inwards, I mean take the lead in finding solutions from within the massive resources and capacities on this great continent. And to refer to your earlier point about what is the value of UNGA and is it worth going there? Well, of course it's worth going there. One of the reasons why Africa has not been taken seriously over many decades is because its voice has not been heard. Now, it's good. The voice is now being heard in G20. We also have the G77, we have the BRICS, and we have many, many fora apart from the African Union and beyond. Now, all that is good. And to have Africa's needs, perspectives, and issues expressed, debated, and honestly considered in fora like the General Assembly can only be a good thing. And that, of course, is also important for building cooperation and alliances and so on. But the UN General Assembly is not a decision-making forum. Yes, it can pass resolutions, as no doubt it will, like, for example, on Sustainable Development Goals. But it's not. But these resolutions, General Assembly, are not binding. They are moral resolutions. They are codes. They are exhortations. They have value. They set norms. They set standards, and all that is good. But that's not going to solve Africa's problems.
True, I quite agree with you, because I watched the rousing speech of the UN Secretary General, and I felt that going by that speech alone, world leaders should actually sit up and take attention. But something can be done. Let's go back to focusing a bit on Africa. The International Crisis Group, the ICG, suggested that for Africa, Mali, Sudan, and South Sudan should be the main conflict areas that the UNGA 78 should address. how much attention do you suppose this should get away from the Ukraine crisis, which some persons have already said is going to dominate conversation? Zelensky is expected.
I agree with you entirely, and with ICG, that conflicts in Africa should deserve attention, and strong attention, and the peace agenda should not be dominated by Ukraine alone. We all agree. However, there are a couple of issues. One, I don't know who decides which is the worst conflict in Africa. Is it Sudan? Is it Mali? Is it Niger? When you are in one of these countries suffering from the abuse of human rights and the violence, when you can't even feed yourself, then it's a moot point whether, somebody's pain or somebody's violence is bigger or better than worse than somebody else's. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I really wish Africans would lead the discussion on these issues. But I'm afraid the African Union and the regional organizations of the African Union are either too ashamed, or they're too cowardly, or they're too internally divided to actually talk honestly about their conflict problems. So this is why these discussions are not going to find much resonance in General Assembly if Africans themselves are not honest about them.
So how can they do that? We have regional bodies, we have the AU, we have ECOWAS. There doesn't seem to be a consensus. Just as we complain about the effectiveness of the UN, we're complaining about how the AU and ECOWAS and others are not doing enough. But there is something that everybody agrees on, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals. This will take center stage, and Africa is one of the regions of the world with enormous gap between the SDG targets and achievement. Could this be an area where you will see an alignment among African leaders as they seek to be heard? What exactly do you expect to see on this particular TOF?
Well, before I come to that, let me just comment on your earlier point. It is true that all international organizations, whether it is global ones like the UN or regional ones like the African Union or sub-regional organizations, are kind of struggling. But that should not mean that individual countries should be paralyzed. Africa has big nations like South Africa, like your own Nigeria, and many others. Why hostage to these organizations? If they are paralyzed or ineffective, then why aren't leading countries in the continent taking the lead? The reason Ukraine is more on the agenda of the UN is not because the UN has put it there, but because certain important and powerful countries have championed that. It is up to African countries who have higher status than other African countries to do the same. Now, come to the SDGs. Yes, totally. I think the SDGs are something that unite us. And, although how many of us can remember that it was almost like a previous age in 2015 when the world came together and agreed such an inspiring and amazing kind of vision for the future. It seems such a long time ago. It's only about 7-8 years ago. Now, having said that, I think the problem with the SDGs is that the means by which the SDGs are to be achieved are dependent on certain enabling factors, peace being one of them, investment in national capacities, and democracy being another one. Now, in the absence of the prerequisites being there, I don't think any sensible financier, even the World Bank, on the reforms for which there is a lot of agitation for, is going to invest. So the issue really for Africa and the SDGs is absolutely we should unite behind that. And we are agreed on what needs to be done: health, education, water and sanitation, and many other public good issues. But the prerequisites for successful progress need to be created in Africa, with Africans in the lead, and international mechanisms like the international financial institutions, African Development Bank and others, playing their proper role in that. Now, if you could have a conversation not about what to do, but how to do it, and what are the trade-offs in doing that along the way, and an honest commitment to that journey, then I think we might make progress. And this year's General Assembly may turn out to be more than just a talk show.
I mean, listening to you, I get a bit scared as to what hope there might be, because peace and democracy are, I mean, there are like fantasies in Africa. We have them in theory, but in practical, we have something similar, but not exactly. So just to deviate a bit, how do you think that African leaders can be better pushed to do what they need to do? Because the last time there was a call for African leaders to converge in, just like we have now, there were concerns about leaving your turf, going to another country and staying there for days, trying to come up with resolutions, like you said, that is not binding, but just has this moral push to do the right thing. How can we begin to push the right buttons and get African leaders to take the lead, maybe in their respective countries, and then we can talk about the global stage?
Hey, first let me say, don't be depressed or discouraged. At least, I've been critical in our conversation, but the last thing I want to do is to leave you and your viewers depressed or discouraged. Africa is in turmoil. That's because people, more of them are internet connected, more of them have got mobile phones, more of them are educated, more of them are aware. They're agitated. They're agitating for a better life. They're agitating for fairness. They're agitating for inheriting the riches of the continent in a more equitable manner. And they're moving beyond colonialism and arguing about the historical causes of their suffering to taking destiny into their own hands. So I actually look upon Africa's troubles not as a sign of a weakness, but as a sign of potential change and potential opportunity. And the bad leaders, most of them are getting very old and in position for too long. They are quaking in their boots, and if they're not, they should be. So I'm afraid this phase of instability is a necessary part of the development process if you actually look at history elsewhere in other continents as well. I think Africans are in a hurry, and rightly so. But then I think, and they should be perhaps, but at the same time, they should not be put off by the turmoil that we're facing at the present time. This is a challenge, but it's a challenge that African people are equipped to undertake. So I've been working in the area of development and international affairs for many decades. I am more optimistic than ever that Africa will come out of it, but there will be pain along the way. And I'm afraid you have to suffer that pain and suffering along the way and resolve that you're not going to be shortchanged by your own establishments, by your own leaders, and bring about the change. Outside world can't do that. Gone are the days when one could intervene in countries, and thankfully so, because those interventions make things even worse. So I'm not sure answering your question other than to say that I think it's struggle, continuous struggle, country by country, region by country, region by region. That is the answer to the problems, including
I'm so engrossed listening to you. I forgot that we have very short time, and all the questions I have prepared, I barely touched most of them. But it's been really engaging talking with you, Professor Mukesh Kapila. Thank you very much for giving us your time and providing some insight to the ongoing activities at UNGA.
Thank you.